Good day. Welcome to the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation's web talk, Combating the Anti-Semitism Virus in the UK, with our special guest, Gideon Falter. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, and will be today's moderator. Our organization is a registered charity based in Toronto, focused on education about anti-Semitism and its latest very virulent iteration, anti-Zionism. We work to counter the negative, dishonest narratives about Israel and provide historical and legal truth about the rights of Jews to the land of Israel, beginning with the British commitment in the Balfour Declaration and subsequent international resolution in 1920 that confirmed the Jewish people's right to reestablish the Jewish homeland in the area known as Palestine. One of our major goals is the very bigoted anti-Semitic Israel Apartheid Week on campus, cancelled once and for all. I want to just give you an idea of how the web talk will go. I will introduce Gideon. I want to let you know that everybody listening will be muted, but you're welcome to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And the web talk will be recorded, so you'll be able to see it in a day or two posted on our website. So thank you for joining us. It's now my pleasure to introduce Gideon, who is the Chief Executive of Campaign Against Anti-Semitism in the UK. Gideon studied British, French, and European Union law at the University of Warwick, where he became heavily involved in Jewish causes. He graduated and returned to London in 2005. Gideon joined the then nascent Campaign Against Anti-Semitism in the summer of 2014 as fighting flared between Hamas and Israel and anti-Semitism surged in Britain. He was the principal organizer of Campaign Against Anti-Semitism's major rally outside the Royal Courts of Justice, which called for zero tolerance law enforcement against anti-Semitism. He was elected to lead the campaign in autumn 2014. Gideon has spoken at the House of Commons and given evidence to the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee. His work for Campaign Against Anti-Semitism has been publicly praised by Theresa May, and the Allgemeiner recognized Gideon as one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. The Simon Wiesenthal Center hailed him as a Jewish hero who proves that there are still powerful ways to leverage democratic rules to serve justice and protect the Jewish community. The International Jewish Fraternity, Alpha Epsilon Pi, made Gideon an honorary brother for his services to fighting anti-Semitism. Gideon has worked in various fields, and his charitable work, through his charitable work, he also serves as a board member of the Jewish National Fund in the United Kingdom. So welcome, Gideon.
So good afternoon, Andrea. The virus of anti-Semitism, I think, has been spreading right across the world, and we've seen it emanating, particularly post the Holocaust. There's been a strain of anti-Semitism that has been growing amongst Islamist circles in the Middle East, and which has been sweeping across Europe, fueled really by the far left and the far right. And what we've seen is one European country after another where anti-Semitism has become normalized, where it has become a cost of being Jewish, and where in Britain we were watching this thinking we must make sure that this never happens here. And it was a very strange feeling for me in the summer of 2014 when I was going about my business, leading my life, and I was watching during the Gaza war, I'm sure everybody remembers, and there were a couple of things that particularly struck me about what was happening in London back then. One incident that really struck me was that the UK Jewish Film Festival, which for the entirety of its existence, I think for 13 years, had been using a single venue, the Tricycle Cinema in London, and one day this venue told them, you can't use our venue anymore unless you renounce Israel. You renounce a small grant that you get from the Israeli embassy. And I just thought how outrageous this is. This is not the Israeli Film Festival. It's not even the Zionist Film Festival. It's just the Jewish Film Festival is essentially being thrown out of its venue or told that in order to stay, it has to it has to behave like good Jews. It has to renounce Israel. It has to decide to cast aside some part of its identity. It has to make some kind of political decision just in order to have a Jewish cultural event in this venue. And there was a separate incident which I saw, which was a man walking down Oxford Street, and I saw a photograph of this man walking down the street, and he had a big sign, and it said on it, "Save Gaza, Hitler, you were right." And it was an absolutely appalling scene to see in Britain, to know that that was happening, and to know that when it happened, the police seemed to have made the decision that instead of arresting this man as somebody committing a hate crime, they would in fact protect him and protect his right to peaceful protest, which is of course what happened. And I felt that we'd reached a tipping point in Britain where the lights were starting to flicker. We'd seen lights go off in one European country after another, and suddenly the lights were starting to flicker in Britain. And we started, I went to a demonstration, a group of people who were meeting outside the Tricycle to try to reverse their decision about the UK Jewish Film Festival. And at this demonstration, and you should bear in mind that British Jews don't demonstrate. I mean, British people in general don't do a lot in the way of demonstrations. British Jews particularly don't demonstrate. And we started to organize, and I took a week and a half off work, and I organized by British Jewish standards, huge demonstration outside the Royal Courts of Justice. And our message was very simple. The message was that there must be zero tolerance enforcement of the law against anti-Semitism. And the reason it was so important to me is that in the wake of the Holocaust, one of the things that I felt had really fallen away worldwide, and in Britain in particular, was deterrence. There was no concept amongst anti-Semites. There was no fear of being caught. There was no fear of consequences. They knew that they could engage in anti-Semitism and not really fear anything happening to them as a result. And because of that, they were becoming bolder and bolder and bolder. And during the 2014 Gaza war, there was this absolute outpouring of anti-Semitism and no fear of any consequences. So I wanted to ensure that people were prosecuted, and the group of people that we formed that became Campaign Against Anti-Semitism were all set on ensuring that those who came to harm Jews or to incite hatred against Jews, those people must face the consequences of their actions. And so we held this demonstration outside the Royal Courts of Justice. We had 4,500 people, which for the British Jewish community, if you bear in mind it's actually smaller than the Canadian Jewish community, is a very large number of people. And from there, we started gathering some of the top lawyers in the UK, volunteers, not just from the legal profession, but also from all professions. We had composers and geneticists and different people asking, how can we help? And we started to organize everybody into teams with the intention being to find these anti-Semites, to take evidence of what they were doing, and to ensure that they were prosecuted. And if they weren't prosecuted, either to privately prosecute them ourselves or to sue the authorities and force the authorities to prosecute them. And that's, in fact, what we started doing. We started private prosecution. We sued the Crown as well and forced them to prosecute a neo-Nazi leader. And we also started to gain media attention, and we started to make the front pages of the newspapers, because at that time, anti-Semitism was not seen as a national problem in Britain. It wasn't seen as a serious problem. And the issue also enabled us to go and speak to politicians who were interested in the idea of anti-Semitism as an ideology which threatened to unravel the whole of British society. And so we went to speak to them, and Theresa May, as you mentioned, was particularly receptive to this, and others since Theresa May as well have been particularly receptive to this, because they understand on an ideological level that if you permit anti-Semitism to run rampant, then society itself is at risk. And in and amongst all of this, about a year into our existence, and for me this was a thing that I was doing as a volunteer, our political and government investigations unit, again, all run by volunteers, came to see me and they said, we need to speak about someone called Jeremy Corbyn. And for those who know of Jeremy Corbyn but don't know that much about him, he's a backbench Labour politician from the far left of British politics. The Labour Party is centre-left. Jeremy Corbyn was from the far left. He was a little-known figure. In fact, when they said we need to speak about Jeremy Corbyn, my first reaction was to say, who's Jeremy Corbyn? And as soon as they showed me the file on Jeremy Corbyn, I started to understand this was a man with a deeply troubling past. He had called Sheikh Raed Salah, who had been in fact banned from entering Britain for espousing the blood libel. Jeremy Corbyn had called him an honoured citizen who must be heard, and he'd invited him to have tea with him on the House of Commons terrace in Parliament. He'd defended Reverend Stephen Sizer, and Reverend Stephen Sizer, for those who know him, is a disgraced Anglican bishop, Anglican priest, who had said that Israel was behind 9/11. He had called Hamas and Hezbollah his friends, Jeremy Corbyn again. So we started to see the broad strokes of somebody who had an extremely troubling standpoint. And we realized that we needed to make the country aware of who this person was, and to really try and make the Labour Party aware of this person who they risked propelling into power. And at the time, Jeremy Corbyn was standing to be leader of the Labour Party, and he was seen very much as a sort of no-hope candidate. And I think this is the danger of complacency, and also the danger of being quiet about anti-Semitism, because there was always this view that Jeremy Corbyn posed no real threat. He was an outsider, he was on the fringes. How could he possibly ever come into a position of power? And I think many people knew of his troubling record, but nobody particularly ever sought to do something about it. They felt that he was somebody who could be tolerated on the fringes, who would always exist, the sort of background anti-Semitism or the background troubling politician that you just have to accept in life. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn was then the beneficiary of a series of phenomenal flukes and became the leader of the Labour Party. And I think many of those who have tuned in will know what comes next. But what we see is Jeremy Corbyn take the Labour Party, which was the most fiercely anti-racist party, which actually gave Britain most of its legislative framework around fighting anti-Semitism. And what he did is he took the Labour Party over to the far left. And on his journey, many of Jeremy Corbyn's fellow travellers from the far left entered the Labour Party, or at least entered positions of power within the Labour Party. And what we start to see is the institutionalization of anti-Semitism within that party. So what I mean by institutionalization is that the people on the far left of the Labour Party who followed Jeremy Corbyn in, they started to espouse anti-Semitic ideology, and they also started to take positions of power within the party. So when you had people who were engaged in anti-Semitic acts within the Labour Party, normally you would go and complain to the Labour Party about it and something would happen, but they started to take over the disciplinary machinery of the Labour Party. So we end up going from the situation in 2014 where Jeremy Corbyn's not even on the radar, and where we're not really even aware of his existence. We're dealing with a wave of anti-Semitic crime, the like of which this country has not seen perhaps since the 80 years ago, when the British Union of Fascists was dissolved, and in the short time thereafter, where there were anti-Semitic riots in Britain. But certainly in generations, certainly in my lifetime, we'd never seen anything like it. Certainly since records began of anti-Semitic crime, we'd never seen anything like it. So we were already in this very, very dangerous situation where this wave of anti-Semitism had been crossing Europe, and suddenly it was at our shores, and the anti-Semitic crime rate was through the roof. And on top of that, suddenly an anti-Semitic man comes and takes over the Labour Party and turns it from an anti-racist party into essentially an institutionally anti-Semitic party. And that is where we started to really experience difficulty, because if you're dealing with anti-Semitic crime, it's very easy to explain to the public why it's necessary to deal with it. It's crime. But when you're dealing with anti-Semitism in politics, and the people involved are usually saying Zionist rather than Jew, it's very difficult to explain why that is not political discourse about Israel, but they're actually doing something which is hateful towards Jews. And the classic examples being the idea, for example, that Jews are involved in, or Israelis or Zionists are involved in poisoning wells for Palestinians, or that the Israelis are committing atrocities on a par with the Nazis. And so what we had to do is we had to really campaign in the media, first of all, to explain to journalists what modern anti-Semitism was, that it wasn't something that died after the Holocaust. It wasn't the exclusive preserve of the far right, but it was in fact something which was alive and well and had mutated and had grown deep roots within the Islamist world, within the far left. And this sort of Soviet heritage of anti-Semitism lived on in the far left, and it had also been interacting with the anti-Semitism of Islamists. And we had to explain this to the media, again, all done by volunteers. And once that media message once we started to get through to journalists, we then had to put that argument in such a way that the British people understood that not only anti-Semitism existed and that it had a new form, but also that it was dangerous to them and British society in general. And essentially what we were hoping all along was that Jeremy Corbyn would see that he was on the wrong side of history, and that he would take action against anti-Semites within his party, that he would take action, or he would also apologize for what he'd been doing. But as time went on, we found out more and more about Jeremy Corbyn, and we started to realize that this was somebody actually who had a problem with Jews himself. My firm belief is that Jeremy Corbyn is himself an anti-Semite. He has a problem with Jews. And one of the things that tipped me over the edge on the Jeremy Corbyn issue, because you would look at Jeremy Corbyn and you would think, maybe this guy is just incredibly incompetent. He claims to be an anti-racist, but he keeps spending all of his time with extremists, with people who are even Holocaust deniers, and he's spending all of his time with these people. Maybe he's just incredibly incompetent. Maybe he doesn't do a very good job as a politician of vetting who he spends time with. And the thing that led me to believe not that he is incompetent or stupid, but that he's actually malevolent, possibly also incompetent and stupid, but certainly malevolent, was an incident we discovered from 2010. And 2010, 27th of January, it's Holocaust Memorial Day in Britain. It's the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. It's a day which is marked mostly around the world now as an International Holocaust Memorial Day. And whilst everybody in Britain who has an interest in the Holocaust is busy commemorating the Holocaust and trying to teach the next generation its lessons, Jeremy Corbyn does something different. Jeremy Corbyn books a room in Parliament. He organizes in this room an event called From Auschwitz to Gaza. And the first speaker stands up and says that, makes a presentation, and we know that this is a presentation he'd been making at various different places. And in fact, we also know that Jeremy Corbyn was warned before the event that this is the presentation that he'd been making. And in this presentation, he says that the Jewish religion has been supplanted by the Holocaust religion, whose high priest is Elie Wiesel. So if you just take that and think about what that means, if you think that this is Holocaust Memorial Day and you're sitting in Britain's Parliament, the mother of parliaments as it's called, and somebody is standing there telling you that the Jewish religion now essentially is almost pornographically obsessed with the Holocaust to the extent that it has been replaced by worship and idolatry of the Holocaust as its own end. And Elie Wiesel is the high priest, the chief cheerleader of this new Holocaust religion. It's a disgusting thing to say. It's a disgusting thing to say, especially on Holocaust Memorial Day. And yet when people remonstrated with the speaker, Jeremy Corbyn asked the policeman in the corridor to come and take them out. And what we understand from this event is that once that first speaker had finished, another speaker dialed in from Gaza, and he said that the Nazis had successfully Nazified the consciousness of their victims. Now, if you unpack that, the only thing that makes sense as meaning is that the Nazis actually managed to turn the Jews in their very consciousness into Nazis. And I couldn't look at that and think, okay, this is just somebody who is incompetently spending time with anti-Semites. I looked at Jeremy Corbyn's acts there to organize the event, to ignore warnings, and then to host the event, and then to throw out people who remonstrated with the speakers. I looked at that and I thought, this is somebody who's got a problem with Jews. This is an actual anti-Semite that we're dealing with. And all along the way, we've been trying to make the British public aware of this. We've been trying to get the Labour Party to deal with Jeremy Corbyn and the people he was putting into positions of power. We were trying to get them to deal with the anti-Semites in their party. And over time, we realized it was not working. And we increasingly turned to the media to expose the cases that we were finding. And we had a lot of people researching anti-Semitism in all political parties. And they kept coming back to me with examples from the Labour Party. And I remember, in fact, at one point saying to them, you know, is there something disproportionate going on in the way that you are researching these cases? Why do you keep coming up with cases from the Labour Party? And we examined it, and there was nothing disproportionate going on. The Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn had become awash with people, many of them new members of the party, who had a problem with Jews. And we, as well as making our case in the media, we also started to look at legal options. And in fact, it was the Labour Party in 2006, back when it was an anti-racist party, which created something called the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which in the UK is the body charged with enforcing human rights in Britain, making sure that people didn't breach equality and human rights legislation. And what we did is we instructed lawyers, and we are now in fact the complainant in a statutory national investigation into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It is the only time that a political party has been investigated under the Equality Act in Britain. And I know that this is something, Andrea, which you were keen to talk about, so we'll talk about that perhaps in a little bit more depth later. And it's a quite unprecedented situation where we went into an election at the end of last year, where one of the parties in the election was actually under statutory investigation by the state, by the National Human Rights Enforcement Agency. So, as you know, Jeremy Corbyn suffered a huge defeat at that election. We're not a political organisation. We don't campaign for one party or another to win elections. All that we did is that we showed people what was going on in terms of anti-Semitism in British politics. And it seems that that was something that actually did resonate with the public over the years, to such an extent that when they came to make their choice in the election, some of the polling that took place afterwards revealed that actually a very large swathe of British people who normally vote for the Labour Party actually were so disgusted by anti-Semitism in the Labour Party that they actually deserted or abandoned their party and voted with another party. And I think that's one of the things which has been one of the most important lessons here. The first lesson I mentioned was don't be quiet, don't be complacent. I think one of the big lessons that we learned in the polling that came out following the election last year is there are actually a lot of decent people in most of society, and if you tell them about a racism problem, they will find it revolting. And you've got to believe in your fellow citizens to take umbrage against anti-Semitism and to act against it.
I don't know why the screen has just gone to a photo of you rather than you. There we go. Okay.
I apologize. Sorry, just 1 second here. I'll just stop. Sorry. Can you see me again?
No, just the poster of you. I can see your there you
Is
are.
that better?
Yeah.
I apologize for that.
Okay. Are you ready for questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So one of the things that we heard, and first of all, I have to congratulate you on the campaign, because we certainly watched it from afar, and Jews around the world were shuddering. Just thinking the possibility of Corbyn getting elected federally was very scary. During that time, we heard that many Jews were preparing to leave England had he been elected, had the Labour Party been elected. Has this changed? Do you have a sense of the perspective, the attitudes now of the Jewish community?
So towards the end of last year, depending on the polling, somewhere between 42 and 47% of British Jews were considering leaving the country. That's an enormous number of people. I mean, if you consider that that's not the number of people who were worried about anti-Semitism, that's the number of people who are actually considering uprooting their lives and leaving their home country to go somewhere else in the world. That's a very worrying statistic. Now, since then, I'm not sure what change there has been in that number, because polling hasn't been carried out recently. The most recent polling that I'm aware of is the polling we conducted with King's College London, and that showed a vast percentage of people, not just that they were thinking of leaving, but it said that the reason they were thinking of leaving was anti-Semitism in politics. I think a lot of people are looking at Jeremy Corbyn's successor and thinking, is he going to take action? And so far, we have heard some strong messages that he is going to take action, but we've seen no actual action. And I think if the last few years teach us anything, it's not to believe the promises, because Jeremy Corbyn also promised firm action against anti-Semitism for years. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn came to power in the summer of 2015, and 4.5 years later, when he stood down as Labour leader following that crushing election defeat, he had still yet to really take any meaningful action. He'd taken plenty of action to defend anti-Semitism within his party and to stop it being scrutinised, but he hadn't really done very much to actually address it properly.
That was the impression that I had, was that the new leader has made very promising statements, and he has some Jewish-Israeli connection as well, personally. Is that right?
I don't know of any Israeli connection. The Jewish connection that he has is that his wife's father is Jewish, and his wife and children are members of a synagogue in London. I, to be honest, wouldn't really put any stay by that. Because I don't believe that Keir Starmer is an anti-Semite. I believe that he is the leader of a party which has an institutional anti-Semitism problem, and I'm interested in whether he's actually going to do something about that. I don't care who his friends and family are. I don't care particularly even what he believes, if he's not actually going to take action. So it's early days at this point. We're approaching 2 months into his leadership, so it's early to make too much of a judgment. But so far, the early tests that we have seen, Keir Starmer hasn't actually done anything about it. And so we'll have to see whether the action materializes or not. In the meantime, we're expecting quite soon for the Equality and Human Rights Commission to issue its report, which will mean that the Labour Party has a legally enforceable action plan that it must follow.
Okay. One of the positives in all of, despite what was happening in the party, is that England itself had adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, correct? It was one of the first 2 countries that did so. So
yeah, we were very pleased with that. I worked very hard with my colleagues to convince Theresa May's government to become the first in the world to adopt the definition. It was an effort which was also joined from within her party by Lord Eric Pickles, then Sir Eric Pickles, who really campaigned very hard for the definition to be adopted. I had many meetings with the team at Downing Street, urging them to adopt the definition of anti-Semitism. And I think there was a little bit initially, there was a little bit of a confusion as to why this was so important to us, because there were many, you know, if you think about anti-Semitic crime, particularly, and what was going on with anti-Semitism in politics, there were many priorities in fighting anti-Semitism. And the reason that we were so clear that the definition had to be accepted and adopted is that if you don't define what anti-Semitism is, you can't fight it. If you can't identify it, you can't fight it. So we needed the definition. And when Theresa May adopted it in 2016, it really became a huge tool. And the point, I think, at which the public became most aware of the definition was actually 2 years later. Because once the government adopted the definition, lots of other bodies started to adopt the definition too. So municipalities, universities, all sorts of organizations, from the UK's College of Policing through to the Crown Prosecution Service. So there was this widespread adoption of the definition. And when it came to the Labour Party said, no, we're not going to adopt this definition. We're going to adopt a different version that Jeremy Corbyn likes. And so it started this really front page debate within the UK about what the definition of anti-Semitism should be. And again, we were very vocal on that. We really were at the forefront of the media campaign, saying, look, it's not up to you how to define anti-Semitism. You don't particularly get a say in what anti-Semitism is. We know what anti-Semitism is. This is an international definition which has been adopted by countries around the world, which has been adopted by the leading institutions within British society. And the Labour Party doesn't get to have its own version of anti-Semitism, its own definition. And I think the reason that Jeremy Corbyn's party was so reluctant to adopt the definition is because Jeremy Corbyn had breached the definition of anti-Semitism. That's what makes him, in my view, an anti-Semite. He's breached a definition of anti-Semitism. And what it gave the British public, though, which I think was very beneficial, was this front page debate about what the correct definition of anti-Semitism should be. And so the British public became, as far as I'm aware, the only public in the Western world where there was this sort of national media scrutiny of what modern anti-Semitism looks like, how it differs to some of the more classical forms of anti-Semitism that we've seen, how it disguises itself, why it's important, for example, to recognize that if somebody says that Israelis or Zionists behave like Nazis, they're committing an anti-Semitic act, that it's not discourse about Israel, it's hatred of Jews through the Jewish state. So we had this I think, essential public debate on anti-Semitism because we'd got the definition in place, and because then one of the leading institutions, the Labour Party, refused to adopt it in such a public way.
I think it leads to several questions on my part, and also the idea that we need to do more. The definition was adopted here, but I suspect that 99.9% of Canadians have no idea that that's happened. There was one press release in the Jewish media and absolutely nothing that I recall seeing in the mainstream media. So, but my question is, it's one thing to adopt a policy, but if you don't have an implementation plan, an enforcement plan, a monitoring plan, not much happens. In the US, they have a special envoy on combating and monitoring anti-Semitism, and then a number of pieces of legislation fall out of that. I think now 30 states have taken a position. I didn't know many institutions in the UK had. I'm impressed to hear that. I was looking for universities. I think I found Birmingham had adopted it because it's a huge issue here. My question is, do you see a specific action plan now coming from the Conservative government? And might it be something like a special envoy, or how would you see this played out?
So we have in Britain, we actually do have somebody within the government who's responsible for advising on anti-Semitism. It's not the same role as that of Ilan Carr, the special envoy from the United States for combating anti-Semitism. Although Ilan's role specifically is outside the United States rather than within the United States. He's actually been a huge ally to us in getting our work done in Britain. But within the UK, what sort of action plan is there? I mean, this is critical, because we now have municipalities, universities being instructed by the government to adopt this definition, or to at least consider adopting it. There's this sort of high level of local independence, but we're slowly seeing, and in fact we've got a report coming out on this coming up soon, we're slowly seeing wider and wider adoption of the definition. The problem is that the definition alone is not enough, and you can't really use the definition as a sort of measure of how effectively a country is dealing with anti-Semitism. It's an indicator, but it doesn't really tell you how well it's enforcing its laws. And in fact, Britain has had laws against anti-Semitism for a very long time, but they just haven't been enforced. And the Crown Prosecution Service, for example, has adopted the definition of anti-Semitism, but it's an absolutely diabolical underperformer on prosecuting anti-Semitism, to the extent, as I mentioned, we've had to actually sue the Crown Prosecution Service, which in itself is quite a big undertaking, and we've had to undertake private prosecutions ourselves. The thing that I was very pleased to see in Canada was that the definition was adopted within a policy of the government. It's not the same as the government, the Prime Minister standing up, and I don't believe that your Prime Minister has done this, and saying, I, on behalf of the government, adopt this definition. Its inclusion in a policy is certainly welcome, but one would hope to see more full-throated support for the definition from the government than we've so far seen. And I look at what's going on in Canada, and in some way I see a reflection of what we saw in the UK sort of just around 2014, which is that as a British person, I was looking at the rest of Europe saying, it's terrible what's going on over there. We can't let it happen here. We must fight back. And what I see in Canada when I visit, and up until the coronavirus, I'm supposed to be in Canada right now, but I visit fairly often because the members of the Canadian Jewish community have been asking us, whether we would consider setting up some kind of operation in Canada to help, which we've been considering. But the thing that I find slightly concerning is that the government has adopted the definition within a policy, and I see this reflection of myself in 2014. I kind of see that amongst Canadian Jews now, because I think a lot of people in the Canadian Jewish community look at Britain and look at the rest of Europe and say, God, that's terrible. We mustn't let it happen here. And yet the same trends are happening. There is the spike in anti-Semitic incidents, which was recently reported and which is reported now every year as a matter of course. We have seen this growth of anti-Semitic rhetoric within certain fringes of Canadian politics. We've seen this terrible situation at Canadian universities. And the thing that worries me is that I had no idea how fast anti-Semitism would grow within this country, would take hold of the Labour Party, for example. I would never have predicted that when we started in 2014, and yet a year later in 2015, an anti-Semite took control and took leadership of the Labour Party. I think that the similar thing is happening now in Canada, where people are looking at the situation in Europe saying, that's terrible, it's not as bad here, we've still got time. And the fact is, unless you're very lucky, you probably don't have time. And had we started to build the defenses in Britain that we have now, 5-10 years ago, then we would be in a much better situation. And I think that the Canadian Jewish community really needs to act very fast to try to stem the flow of anti-Semitism that is coming from the fringes of Canadian society.
Thank you for that. I'm going to make sure that gets broadcast. I think many people are in denial, or they are passively resistant because they don't like it. They feel that they're opposing it rather than actually taking action. And although we have only a very small fringe party, a little bit fringe in the sense of the Green Party, their candidate to replace Elizabeth May is Jeremy Corbyn's twin. And should he come in, then that party is a lost cause. You know, plenty of Jews are in favor of environmentalism as an issue, but they certainly would be upset if they saw the party become very anti-Semitic. So I think we do need to talk. One of the things that also differentiates the UK, though, and I'm sure most of us who read this from afar were impressed, is you have a Jewish structure, a community structure that includes a chief rabbi. And lots of articles I read said how impressed they were with, but also surprised by, the fact that chief rabbi spoke up. Can you talk about his role, and is that something we should be looking at? Our community is not large, for almost 400,000 Jewish people, but umpteen institutions, and there is no rabbinical body that speaks for the Jewish people.
We've got a chief rabbi. The chief rabbi, I thought, came out extremely strongly and absolutely rightly on the issue with the Labour Party and on Jeremy Corbyn in particular. He did that in an unprecedented action for the chief rabbi in this country. I don't think, though, that following on from what's happened, there will be greater unity within the Jewish community in Britain, just because there are lots of different organizations with lots of different agendas. You know, it's a community. At the end of the day, communities are full of people with different views, and they don't always see eye to eye. And on some things they will agree and work together, and on other things they won't. And it's just a reflection, not just on Jews, but on everybody. Unfortunately, there is not always the unity that one would hope to see.
For sure. I just thought maybe the chief rabbi had a particular, it was significant that he spoke, and that might have been very impactful in terms of how the public saw the problem.
It was hugely impactful, you're right. I mean, the chief rabbi is a hugely respected figure within the Jewish community and also outside the Jewish community. So when the chief rabbi weighs into a debate, it carries a great deal of gravitas. And I think in particular, what was so powerful about the chief rabbi's intervention was that the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the head of the Church of England, then backed the chief rabbi. And so I think a lot of people said, well, hang on a minute, these people with great gravitas and very respected positions are intervening on an issue on which they never would normally speak. That's important.
Okay, before I go to questions from the attendees, I want to ask about how the pandemic and anti-Semitism are being portrayed if you're running into anti-Semitism related to that. What I'm seeing is a lot of anti-Zionist association with the pandemic, that this is an Israeli scheme or a Jewish scheme, the disease was created by the Jews to control the world. Are you seeing that?
I mean, anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism is definitely one of the places where anti-Semitism is most innovative, as it were. I mean, you see conspiracy theories where people saying, well, Israel obviously created coronavirus, and the proof would be if Israel is the first to release a vaccine. I mean, so we're very conscious of this. There is an anti-Semitic, modern day sort of anti-Semitic hate preacher in the UK called David Icke, who, for example, has said that Israel has been using the coronavirus pandemic to test its technology. Normally, he is speaking about how the world is controlled by what he calls Rothschild Zionists. So we've seen people who are typically in this sort of anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic milieu, changing their messaging to fit with the times. And anti-Semites often are innovators, and unfortunately there's no difference here. We've seen all sorts of people saying all sorts of things about coronavirus, and I think the most important thing that people can do, whether in the British Jewish community or in the Canadian Jewish community, is to really shine a spotlight on that, because I think there is often a sort of an instinct to not draw attention to anti-Semitism. I think when it's this ridiculous and this outrageous, I think it's actually very useful to shine a spotlight on it, because as we learned, particularly with what happened in the Labour Party, normal people look at this and they just find it revolting. They're not persuaded by it, they just find it disgusting.
Actually, that's a very important point for us to consider also, because what I have noticed is that our government and our healthcare structure has spent enormous amount of time telling us not to be racist against Asians or Chinese people, by calling it the China virus or the Wuhan virus or whatever, because that would denigrate a whole population. But nobody is saying don't call it an Israeli virus or use it to promote anti-Semitism. And in fact, I haven't seen a single media story about how that's being used, and yet I believe it's actually more of a problem than saying the China virus. In fact, the dissident Chinese community here is calling it the Chinese communist virus.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the reason that there is such an emphasis on discrimination against people of Asian appearance, particularly, is because it's a much bigger problem. I think many more people think that the virus is somehow the fault of Chinese people than think it's the fault of Jewish people. But the thing is that a lot of people currently think it's the fault of Jewish people because they're hearing conspiracy theories. And it doesn't have to be that many people to actually really start sort of posing a threat. But what I don't think that we're seeing a particular threat of people hating Jews because of coronavirus. I think what we're seeing a particular threat of is conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites changing their views to fit with the times. And I think this is an opportunity for us to shine a light on that. And to say, look, this is a completely outrageous modern form of anti-Semitism, and shine a light on it to show the kind of thing that Jews are subjected to. And I think most people will look at that and say, anti-Semitism truly is alive and kicking. This is a very contemporary form of anti-Semitism, and it needs us. We need to stand up to it.
Well, that would be important for us to do here. You spoke about different organizations, institutions adopting IRA. Can you talk about how you might have affected that? For example, with police, were police or military, not military, but security agencies involved in adopting IRA?
I mean, we've seen the College of Policing, in fact, adopted the IRA definition before IRA did. The definition actually doesn't originate with IRA. It originates with the European Union Monitoring Centre on Xenophobia and Racism in 2005, and it was only adopted by IRA a couple of years back, a few years ago. So actually, the UK College of Policing started using the definition even before IRA was using the definition. And I think, look, one of the things that we've seen that's been really beneficial is this increased use of the definition to understand anti-Semitism. So not just looking at cases of anti-Semitism and how to fight, how to address them, but before there is a case, looking at what anti-Semitism is and understanding it in its modern context. So it's really, firstly, a teaching tool before it's any kind of enforcement tool. And I think that's really important as a tool for educating society about what anti-Semitism looks like in the modern day.
Would you recommend, you said that you did a kind of a review of all political parties, some kind of an analysis of where anti-Semitism might be within all the parties to start with? Was that a...
Yeah, so we look at cases within every political party. We look at cases of anti-Semitism, and within the Labour Party, there is a massively disproportionate problem with anti-Semitism amongst its people. And in fact, we obtained, for example, an internal dossier from within the Labour Party, which just, I think, for one meeting in one particular month, documented in bullet point form 86, I think it was, or 89 pages of allegations of anti-Semitism by Labour Party members. And so, we are just, we publish this on our website. We make sure that people are aware of it. We draw the attention of journalists to the information that we find, because we want anti-Semites in any political party to face the consequences of what they're doing. And we want the public to know if a political party fails to take action, as the Labour Party was failing to do.
Well, we certainly were familiar with the Labour Party. That's why I wondered if you did the review of any other individuals came to light, or actions or policies within any other party actually came to light, or was it entirely Labour, only Labour.
There are other political parties in the UK which have problems. None of them have a problem on a scale like the Labour Party. So we engage with other political parties as well. Generally, it's a positive engagement. We have some trouble sometimes. We're currently having trouble with another political party in the UK in particular, but we are, we are a long way from seeing a problem on the same massive scale as the problem within the Labour Party.
I don't think we have a particular party that's problematic, but we do have a number of Islamists within parties, federally, provincially. Have you dealt with people who are, who I would not say just far left, far right, but are very Islamist oriented in terms of pushing various agendas? I think you were very aware of the M103 issue that was raised here in Canada, the campaign to try to make sure the government didn't adopt Motion 103, which it did adopt. And there are strong members within the party, federally, Liberal Party and some others, that push that agenda, which in itself has got anti-Semitic overtones.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with the motion, but we've had a lot of experience dealing with Islamists in the UK. One of the things that struck me was, this recently we just had the so-called Alkyds Day, this event, that annual event, generally sponsored by the regime in Iran, which is used around the world by anti-Semites as a platform. We actually had, it used to be that there was an annual march through London on Alkyds Day, where they would fly the flag of Hezbollah and they would carry placards saying, "We are all Hezbollah." And we managed to get the law changed in the UK, so Hezbollah was outlawed in its entirety as a terrorist organization. Up until last year, it was actually only recognized that the military wing of Hezbollah was a terrorist organization. Of course, there is no such thing as any other kind of wing of Hezbollah. It's not like they've got a political wing and a military wing, which are separate. They've got one wing, which is Hezbollah. And so we managed to get Hezbollah entirely banned within the UK as a terrorist organization. We then also were able to get the law changed so that the police had the right to seize the flag and arrest anybody carrying the flag of a terrorist organization. So the Hezbollah rallies through London stopped. It's still a very difficult thing because a lot of Islamists will disguise their anti-Semitism as sort of anti-Zionism or hatred of Israel as opposed to hatred of Jews. And what we have to do in these cases is explain why hatred of Jews is actually the same thing as anti-Zionism, why anti-Zionism is the same thing as hatred of Jews. So that's been a challenge and remains a challenge, but we've been quite successful in convincing the authorities that they need to understand this challenge and deal with it.
My last question, Alkyds rally used to take place here every year also. And because of the virus, because we were isolating, it didn't happen physically, but everything went online. Have you seen a move to that? We had APCA Day, we had Alkyds Day, we have IAW, the Israel Apartheid Week, lectures, they all went online. So I don't know whether it could be a bigger draw because of that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of, when social media started to take off a number of years ago, we saw vast new crowds of people hearing messages they never normally heard and being sort of whipped into and incited into hatred that they would never normally hold. And so really what social media did was it amplified the voices of extremists and allowed them to reach larger audiences. What the pandemic has done is other extremists who perhaps hadn't modernized in the same way are now modernizing, and they are reaching larger and larger audiences through social media, through Zoom webinars and Zoom demonstrations and all of the various things that are done. So we've got this problem where on the one hand, we're seeing people on the extremes using the pandemic as a method to sort of stop, innovate, reach larger audiences. And on the other hand, we're also seeing them using the fact that the Jewish community is reliant now on technology as well to do things like invading Jewish events on Zoom, even disgustingly doing things like bombarding funeral services and shivers with really disgusting racist abuse. So we are seeing a shift of anti-Semites online, just like we've seen a shift of everything online. In a way, it makes it easier for us to monitor because we no longer have to sneak somebody into a meeting somewhere. We can just dial in via Zoom. So, you know, it's a difficult situation that we're all in, and the anti-Semites are having to innovate, and we're having to innovate to catch them.
Okay, Gideon. Well, I think that you've identified a lot of work that we need to address here in Canada, a lot of issues and some strategies that I think would be helpful, and I really appreciate that. So on behalf
Thank you. I really commend you on your work and hope that we can help you in any way that we can.
I appreciate that. So thank you very much for today, and thank you to those who've attended. And as I said earlier, we will have the recording available in a day or two on our website. And I wish everybody a good day. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.